Us who have never had an orthodox concept of God, or to a lot of people who went into the metaphysical movements years and years and years ago and have lost everything they originally knew, this all seems strange to us. But because it was very hard to imagine that there are people, you know, that have been to school and been educated and still can believe that there is such a thing as a God who cares about Mrs. Jones but not about Mrs. Brown and so forth, or cares whether you got dunked or didn't get dunked. But now that this is coming to the surface, and more especially since my books have been out and ministers first began to take cracks at me and then all of a sudden began to study, this comes as the outstanding subject for everyone to think about, more especially those who are in the Orthodox teachings. You will see from the response to this book that the reason that only 8% of the people who are born into the Church of England and Australia attend, and only 12% in England. And you say, why not the rest? Well, of course, they could get the rest the same as the American churches do by turning it into a social community center and starting with babysitting and on up into the teenage dances and pie baking contests and all. They could attract them too, but in those churches they don't. They stick strictly to church activities, not social. And therefore they can't attract them. And the answer has always been why. And we, of course, even when we meet these people, can't say what we think is why or what we know from our experience with people, because we're not authoritative. But now that it's coming to the surface through Bishop Pike in California, this Bishop of Woolwich there, Bishop Sheehan, who says on the air that please never pray to God for a material thing, he has none to give you. It is coming out into the surface now that the people, long before their churches realized it, the people were through with that old concept of God, even though they had nothing with which to replace it. But they knew they were through with that. Now, the question he raises, Bishop of Woolwich, is the question, of course, that has been settled with us for 90 years. And that is, number one, there is no such God as the world has prayed to ever since the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There has been no such God. Probably the one who caught the greatest vision, nearest approaching the one true God, was Gautama the Buddha. And undoubtedly next to him was Jesus Christ. Surprising that one had a clearer vision, but Jesus was limited by the Hebrew church in which he was educated, in which he was trained. And although he did go far, he didn't go far enough because the Christian church has adopted the Hebrew God. I've said to our students for many, many years, the Christian church is really the Hebrew synagogue with a crucifix. Why? They have the same God that rewards, the same God that punishes, the same God that you can pray to destroy your enemies, the same God that's personal in every sense, punishing, rewarding, and so forth and so on. And all of that comes to us from the Hebrew Testament, as you know. Now, today, that God is not going to satisfy people. Because in this age of education and scientific enlightenment, the people are going to say, prove it to me. Now, you've told us that we had to get baptized in order to be in God's grace, but we find that we're baptized and we're no better off than our unbaptized neighbors. You told us we must go to communion or to confession, and we do it, but we're no better off than our neighbor next door. When there's unemployment, we're unemployed and he's unemployed. And when there's an epidemic, he gets sick and we get sick. And they don't say this in words, but back of their minds, they can't formulate it in words, but that's what they're thinking. Well, with the advent of Christian Science and Unity and New Thought, they began to switch their concepts of God from one that you begged and pleaded with to one that you could use. They made a terrible blunder in that they perpetuated the idea that the new God that they found would do for them the things that the old God didn't. The old God didn't get them an automobile, and the old God didn't heal their diseases, and the old God, but now the new God will. Of course, that's all wrong. And the reason it's wrong, you can readily see. There can only be one God. Now, it really makes no difference what part of the world you're in, or whether you're dealing with black or white or Jew or Gentile. There can only be one God. It's the same God that brought forth this universe in India that brought forth the universe in North America. There's only one God. To acknowledge that there's only one God is the only way you will ever break down racial prejudice, bias, and bigotry. Because as long as people are allowed to believe there is a Hebrew God, or there's a God for Protestants, or a God for Catholics, or a God for Baptists, and not for... that bias and bigotry will be there. The very moment that you make that one thing clear, that there is only one God, and this God that we are worshiping is the same God that everyone else is worshiping, there's only the different forms of worship. But the God must be the same God, because there can't be more than one. You know, the minute that happens, you can understand the Master saying, call no man on earth your father. We have only one Father. But he's your father and mine. Whether I go to church or I don't go to church, he's got to still be my Father. And to be God can't any more cast me off than the prodigal son was cast off. The prodigal son can cast himself off from the Father. But in any minute that he turns back, the Father has to be there for him. The Father did not excommunicate him. The Father did not excommunicate the woman taken in adultery or the thief on the cross. Because in the instant that they turned, there was the Father, there was the Christ, there was the Master. Now, when people learn to fear God, as most people do, that's the end of the usefulness and practicalness of God in their lives. If they believe that God causes sickness, or, like the funeral services usually say, your loving Father called this child home to his bosom with a cancer, made him suffer on a bed for 6 years, and then finally called him home. You know right well that nobody's loving that God. They may pay lip service, because if they say anything in front of the minister, he'll tell them off. But you know in their heart and soul they're not loving that God that struck down their 12-year-old daughter, or that stood by when their other daughter was raped or seduced. Do you see what I mean? In olden days, the church could get away with that because people were ignorant, they were unthinking, and they could be held in line by, you'll go to hell if you don't believe this, so forth and so on. But we are in a day of, if it isn't spiritual enlightenment yet, at least it's scientific education. And people are learning that these planes go up into the stratosphere and they don't find God. And they find also that these same planes are on the downside of the earth and don't strike hell. And even if they don't acknowledge it to you, they will to me. And they'll say, is there a hell down there? Is there a heaven up above? No, how can there be? Because 12 hours of the day, up is down and down is up. Huh? Now, in this age that's coming, it has already come to the metaphysical world, but now it's coming to the church. There is going to be the major subject. What is God? What is God? What is the nature of God? Not that you can say, what is God? Have you seen him face to face? Or what is God? In your limited mind you can tell. What is the nature of God? What is this presence or power we are worshiping? Is it chalking up, for instance, a sin against us for cheating on our income tax, but not chalking up a sin for the government agents that are stealing our money? Is it chalking up sins against us for whatever crime we're committing, and the doctor or the dentist who attends church, he hasn't got it chalked up against him, although he's advocating fluoridation that he knows kills more people than it saves from cavities. Even if it does save from cavities, he knows right well it's destroying the health of people and it's killing them, because he's got the records. No sin against him. Why? Because, well, he's a respectable man. He didn't break any laws. Now, you know that can't be, don't you? At the center of your being and of mine, there is rightness. I don't care how you describe it. You can call it a conscience, if you like, or the presence of God, or the God that seeth in secret. I don't care how you voice it. But at the center of your being, there is a rightness. When you do wrong, whether it's legally wrong or not, that hits up against your center of rightness, and from that minute on, a friction is set up in you. And if it ultimately brings boils or fevers or upset nerves, it's no wonder, because it is setting up a turmoil in you. Now, your neighbor doesn't know it, remember. You're not being punished by the law. But you are being punished, because as a matter of actual truth, God constitutes your being. God breathed his life into you. Not your life, his life. The mind or intelligence of God is yours. You don't have one separate from God. As a matter of fact, you don't have a soul of your own. God is the very soul of your being. And therefore, your whole real being is God being, God essence. And anything that is brought into that isn't right sets up the warfare between the spirit and the flesh. And the reaction is not upon God, upon you. Just as if we hook up the electricity incorrectly and get shocked or electrocuted, the electricity isn't aware of that. It doesn't know it has been defiled. We do. We do. It is for this reason that the Orientals have the law of karma, and we in Christianity have the same law in as ye sow, so shall ye reap. That is the Oriental law of karma. That you, every minute of the day and night, are setting in force the law that will ultimately react upon you. Now, you will discover this, that the more closely you live according to spiritual standards, the more sensitive you are to the Spirit, the less wrong you can do without injury to yourself. The least kind of skullduggery is going to react upon the individual who violates his own spiritual integrity. You see that? On the other hand, the person who is gross, who has never lived very close to God, never thought too much about it, that person can go on for a long time storing up karma. But when it gets to a certain level, even he gets clipped, because he is not violating a God, he is violating his God. God at the center of his being, you see? Now, when we know that we must take seriously the Master's teaching of as ye sow, so shall ye reap, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me, then you see, we can't go to church on Sunday and get absolved. First, there must be the absolution in here. There must be purifying. No minister, priest, or rabbi can absolve us while we're in the same consciousness. This the Master illustrated with a woman taken in adultery. Neither do I condemn thee. Thy sins be forgiven thee. But go and sin no more. In other words, my absolution only lasts for today. Now, it can be permanent if you're willing to make it so. But remember that if you sin tomorrow, a worse thing will come upon you. Right? So with us. An individual comes to us and they're full of sorrow and regret, and we can set them free. You have the power to forgive the same as I have, because as a minister, I don't mean ordained with a piece of paper, but ordained by virtue of your having been drawn into the bosom of God. That's where your ordination comes from. You have the power to forgive sins. You have the power to say, good, in proportion to your regrets and sorrows, in that proportion are you made free by the very Spirit of God that is in you. But go and sin no more, because I can't protect you beyond your next sin. Now, if we know this, we really have a different God than we had before, because the God we had before wouldn't ask any change of us, just long as we went and got forgiven, or went and had some prayer said over us or something or other. We felt holy. Nowhere was it made clear that we really don't have any such powers, except in proportion as there is an inner cleansing. Now, one of my foreign publishers recently decided to have some of my manuscripts retranslated so that they wouldn't use the word you, they would use the word one. One does this, and one should do this, and one experiences this. And I wrote over and I said, yes, for the educated ignoramus, that's right. For the intellectual stupidity, that's fine. But we are not writing for intellectual perfection or standards of literature. We are writing to bring a ministry to you, the person who is reading the book. And I don't want to say to that person, one should forgive one's enemies. That may be good literature. But my business is you. And I'm saying you must forgive your enemies. Now, this is the way the Master spoke. Always it was to you. You must forgive 70 times 7. You must pray for your enemies. You must do unto the least of these my brethren what you would do unto me. You must do unto others as you would have others do unto you. His ministry was always what you must do to fit yourself to receive God's grace. And you see, that is offering an entirely different God than the one that's punishing you and holding you in condemnation and isn't going to let you go. or is going to because you went to confession. No. We have all seen this in life. I have in my business life, playing cards with traveling men till all hours of the night, and then have the Catholics go out to confession in the morning and feeling that their sins are all forgiven them and so forth and so on. In some way, each one of us individually, because the Christ ministry is really addressed to you or to me, because it's always you, the question always comes up, what kind of a God do we have? And as long as we have a God that can be made to break his own laws, we just don't have a God. It's got to be as ye sow, so shall ye reap. And so no one can do anything for us in proportion, except in proportion to our willingness to conform to the laws of God. Now, the obedience of the Ten Commandments is a long way from obedience to God. That's merely the law of human. It's like a legal law. But a person could obey the legal law and still not be spiritual. The Master brought that out, didn't he, when he said that the scribes of the Pharisees were righteous, but your righteousness must exceed that. Now, who could exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? They lived up to every letter of the law. They crossed their T's and dotted their I's. And so how could you get holier than that? He must have made it clear to his disciples that there is a holiness greater than that of obeying the law. Now, we can't possibly know what those spiritual laws are until we have a God of spirit, until we have a God of omnipresence, a God of omnipotence, a God of omniscience. Then we can begin to perceive, go back to the Master's teaching, and see that righteousness that exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees. This loving the neighbor, this praying for the enemy, this considering our neighbor's children as well as our own children. In other words, not what we call the human love, but the divine love that looks upon all of us as neighbors or brothers. You see, there is where we begin to rise in our concept of God when we see that God is really the creator of all men, and therefore that we are only living in God's grace when we are a brother to all men. Now, I have witnessed in my own work that as I could bring out to the student, I don't care what your background is or your past, unless you can agree that there's only one God, and that God is the God of your neighbor and yourself, even your atheist neighbor. The fact that he's not aware of it doesn't change the nature of his God. Only in that degree can you be the man that the Master is trying to reveal to the world. Paul speaks of the man who has his being in Christ. He speaks of the man of earth. Well, the man of earth is that creature that is not under the law of God, neither indeed can be. The man of Christ is that man who has the Spirit of God indwelling. Then, to have the Spirit of God indwelling really brings God right down to where we can also say, the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Whither shall I flee from thy Spirit? If I went up to heaven, thou art there. If I went down to hell, thou art there. If I went through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art there. And as a matter of fact, neither life nor death can separate me from the love of God. Now, the God that is being revealed to the world, that Bishop Pike has caught a glimpse of, Bishop Sheehan has caught a glimpse of, Bishop of Woolwich has caught a glimpse of, and hundreds of others, is this God that is closer than breathing and nearer than hands and feet, that neither gives nor withholds. Well, now, here comes, in my experience, this was one of the wildest experiences I ever had when I started to tell students there is no God that gives and there is no God that withholds. To begin with, if there was a God that gave, it must be because he is withholding. Now, what is God withholding? The diamonds are in the ground, the oil, the silver, the gold, the platinum, the uranium. The fish are in the sea, the birds are in the air, salt in the ocean, crops in the ground, cattle on 1,000 hills. What is God withholding? Nothing. You could look this whole world over and you couldn't truthfully find one thing that God is withholding and saying, I'll let it loose when you do something. In the earliest years of the Depression, I was sitting by a sick woman who had not the faintest concept of anything beyond the wildest orthodoxy. But I mean, she had some kind of an orthodoxy that was sad. But she was crippled from her neck to her ankles with arthritis, bedridden, down to 90 pounds. Doctors had given her up. And some member of the family heard about me and sent for me. Well, it was very evident you couldn't talk to her about God or anything else, because all she could think of was that I must be a holy man and God would answer my prayers. Why he wouldn't answer hers, I don't know. Why he wouldn't answer her ministers, I don't know. They're both probably better as humans than I. And why not answer their prayers? Oh, no, I must be a holy man that God is going to answer. Nonsense. So, I would call on her once a week and just remain silent, pray within myself. But one day, as I sat there doing that, words began to bubble in my head, and I took a whole lot of envelopes out of my pocket, started writing, and when I got through, I had a very, very long piece of doggerel. Went back to my office and wrote it all out on a piece of paper, and it was the most astounding thing in the world. The title of it is, If You Were God. If you were God and your people prayed up to you for food, not to be wasteful, but just, Lord, so that we can keep body and soul together. Clothing, not silks, just to keep our bodies comfortable. Fuel, God. Please, dear God, fuel. Well, I went down through the whole list of it, at least this thing did. Well, if you were God and your people prayed up to you this way, what would you answer? And of course the answer comes back right away from God. Don't look up to me. There's cattle on 1,000 hills, there's fish in the sea, there's vegetables in the... There's gold, there's silver, there's everything else. Don't look up to me. I have no more to give you. It's all there. Look to your men who are destroying those things. But not to me. No more I can do. Well, it was kind of a shock. And after I had it, I didn't know what to do with it. But the following week, I told her about it. And her son was a printer, so she had him print some for me. Well, he printed a stack that big. I had nothing to do with him. But one I sent to a Christian Science practitioner friend of mine in Detroit. And when he received it, Senator Vandenberg was there in his office. So he let the senator read it, and the senator says, "Oh, heavens, where did you get this?" He told him, he'd get permission to reprint it. And he had 100,000 copies printed and distributed in Washington, because that was the time when they were plowing under the sows and taking vegetables out to sea and throwing them overboard so as to keep them off the market, and burning up the cotton in the South so as to keep it off the market. And there was the answer to it. But to me, the answer was this. We pray to God knowing that supply is infinite on earth. It's more like we were asking him to back it up to our doorway. Well, now, there isn't any God that backs things up to your doorway. And there isn't any God that puts Rockefeller's name on oil or the Diamond Syndicate's name on diamonds. That's the work of men. But there is a God that has sent forth this universe into expression, full of everything that we will ever need. As a matter of fact, I came across, through a friend, an old edition of an Encyclopedia Britannica, that has uranium, a worthless metal found in North America. Well, it was worthless then, but evidently it had been provided for atomic use, right? There is an intelligence, and God is an intelligence. Just as God is love, God is an intelligence. That intelligence that makes it impossible for bananas to grow on peach trees or roses to grow on orchid plants. God is the intelligence of nature, just as God is the intelligence of the race. But if we do not know this truth, we will be telling God or begging God. And all of the time, God is not withholding. You know, it's about an hour ago, I watched 3 minor birds on this lawn. Emma had just thrown out a whole day's supply of bread. And then on the walk, seeds for those that like seeds. And here was a whole day's supply for perhaps 40 or 50 birds. And there are only 3 minor birds. One minor bird has found a piece of bread, the other minor bird has found a piece of bread, and the third one is chasing both of them to get their piece of bread. And he will not give them peace. And right in back of him was all this other bread. No, he must have that particular piece of bread. And that is the way we are. We are determined to have things the way we think they should be, when right next to us is more of it than we can handle, whatever it may be. But unless we have come to a higher concept of God that can acknowledge God as the soul of this universe, if we acknowledge God as the soul of this universe, then in our dealings with each other, we don't maintain that same wall up against the other fellow. I say to myself, God is the soul of man. I'd be in an awful mess if I said God was my soul. And leave you out? But if I know that God is the soul of mankind, I'm recognizing God as the soul of every individual, and I'm meeting it. That's what comes back to me. If I recognize God to be the intelligence of this universe, I am not only governed intelligently, but those who come in relationship with me are governed intelligently in their relationship with me. If I recognize God to be the love of this universe, I can't know lack, because I'm not looking to man for it. It'll come through man. But look what a mess we'd be in if we looked to man for it. Oh, how man loves to hold on to his dollars, not part with them. Or he doesn't mind parting with them for a color TV, and the woman doesn't mind parting with them for a new hairdo. But the church or the ministry or something of that kind, believe me, that's measured out in different kinds of terms. Therefore, if we were expecting man to support our ministry, we'd be hitting up against selfishness, fear, his own fear of his own supply. But if I can understand that God is the love of this universe, then God is the source of my supply. It may still come to me through man. It doesn't have to. There are lots of other ways for it to come. But the point is that I will never be limited. But I can't have a God that I'm fearing might be withholding it because I had a wrong thought. I can't have a God that is punishing me because of my parents' or grandparents' sins. Otherwise, I'm in the black hole of Calcutta so far as God is concerned. My only hope of living under the intelligence, the love, the wisdom of God, and in fellowship with man, is in the ability to see that God is the very soul of man, the very intelligence of man, the very love. And the same with all nature. We perform many, many experiments with weather to prove that weather is not a phenomenon of nature. Weather is a phenomenon of the mind of man. And we have proven in our experiments that we can change it pretty nearly at will when it gets rambunctious. We've had marvelous experiments in that line. For years, we no longer experiment because that was done years ago, but we have proven that the person who lives in the realization of God as the Lord of nature, God as the soul of nature, the wisdom of nature, the protector of nature, he will have better crops, whether in his garden or his farm or his herd, because he's not looking to the ground to do it exclusively. He's not doing it to food exclusively. He is back in a principle revealed by the Master: man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. I was called one year to one of our government's agricultural stations where they had dairy cattle, dairy herds. And a disease had sprung up that was killing off the cattle. And within a few days, 200 head of cattle had died, and they were continuing to die off, and there was no way of stopping it, at least none that they knew of. And I was called into that, and in 24 hours it was stopped. 5 years later, it returned in another herd, and I was called into that, and in 24 hours it was stopped. Do you see? Why? Well, it all comes back to God. If God is really the soul of this universe, it must really be the principle of the animals as well as of men. God could not have made man and just left animals out in the cold, could he? That all has to be a part of God's creation. Therefore, God must also be the animating principle of all nature. Okay? True, nature is something separate and distinct from God, but God must be the basic law behind it, or where did it come from, this law of nature? As we see this, and we understand that God must permeate this entire universe, then whatever destructive forces are there disappear. Well, this brings us back to the subject of what is God. In my inner unfoldments or revelations, whatever you call them, over a period of time, the word consciousness became the word God. Why? Well, I don't know if it can be logically explained, but supposing you had no consciousness, would you be conscious? If you were without consciousness, would you be conscious? Could you be conscious of anything without consciousness? In other words, what is it that makes us aware of each other? What is it that makes us aware of laws of God or laws of nature? Do we not have to become conscious of those things? Or in the Master's language, ye shall know the truth? How could you know the truth? Isn't knowing being conscious of, aware of? And so, over a period of time, as this thing ultimately revealed itself, well, the secret of this whole life is consciousness. Consciousness permeates Everything there is. Well, for our purpose and our work, consciousness is that big word. Therefore, when I am meditating or teaching or doing my mail, these birds are singing here and often trying to get in. You think they don't know what it is? When we have animals around, they will come right to the doorway and sit there until you're through meditating, and then they will leave. And this is true in all homes. Or wherever we have cats or dogs, within a very short time they stop chasing birds. They're no longer on the prowl, you see. What does this? The same consciousness permeates this entire universe, and that consciousness is God. As I recognize it, everything and everybody out there is aware of it. I had an experience, I may have told you about it, the chaplain at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Well, one year, the senior chaplain at the Pearl Harbor was a Hebrew rabbi. And the doctor over at our State Mental Institute here was a Harvard professor of psychiatry and had had years and years experience out in the psychiatric world in mental institutes. And he finally came to the conclusion that psychiatry could not cure insanity. And so he started to search for other things, and eventually he turned to the study of spiritual healing to see if he could find the solution in that. And having heard of my work, he sent for me. He arranged a dinner party in his home. Emma and I were invited, and we went there and we spoke. But he had also invited this chief chaplain of the Navy Yard and his wife. And it was very soon evident that his wife had no interest in what we were talking about. But they drove me home from this man's doctor's home. And then the wife opened up. And she said that she heard me use the word mental and the word spiritual as if they were two different things, whereas they were the same thing. Well, there was no use arguing with her. I tried to explain that mental and spiritual couldn't be the same, but I couldn't get to first base. But her husband said, is there any way you could explain it to me that might clarify it for me? Well, I said, you might think of the word consciousness. Oh, he said, that's the word. He said, that word has been plaguing me for years. I know you're on the right track. So they invited me to their home the next week. Well, it seems that this lady had a Persian cat, and that cat would go near nobody but her. It was hers, not even members of the family. It was just hers. I come in and sat down, and the cat made a beeline for me up into my lap and started rubbing my stomach. Looked at me, terrified. How could this happen? Well, she said, do you love cats? Oh, I said, no, I have no feeling for them whatsoever. I was born and brought up in New York City. We didn't have any cats or dogs around us. They were just animals. No? Well, then why does this cat do this to you? Well, I said, you see, there's a spiritual bond between this cat and me. What? Well, yes. You see, there's a God. And the God that made me made this animal. So we're brothers or sisters or whatever it may be. And I know it. I know that I wouldn't harm that cat, and that cat knows I wouldn't harm it. And even if it doesn't feel any human love in me, it knows enough to know that we are one, and it just came home to become one. Huh? Then from there I had to go on and explain to her that in the mental realm you have good and evil. You can use the mind for good or you can use the mind for evil, so it can't be God, because you can't use God for evil. Although there was a Protestant minister who claimed you could. He wrote a book on it, how you could grow plants or kill plants by prayer. I wrote a review of his book that is still steaming fire. Because how can anyone believe that the power of prayer can be destructive? It would mean whatever you're praying to is subject to your will, and you can make it do what you want it to do. Well, you can with your mind, but not with God. Whoever could believe that you could go to God and have God destroy something? That's absolutely beyond even human comprehension. And yet he wrote a whole book on how it could be done in his experiments. Well, now, he was right insofar as you can mentalize, and you can kill a plant, or you can kill an animal or a person. It's been done through witchcraft for centuries. But that has nothing to do with God. That has to do with the power of the mind and making somebody fear you. In other words, getting them under your dominion. But when you come to the subject of God, you can't have a God that would injure or destroy or withhold. Otherwise it can't be God. God is love. And the greatest proof that we have of that makes it possible for us to believe in Christianity, is that the Master said, I have come to do the will of the Father. Now, who did he kill? Who did he injure? The Master. Nobody. He came to heal the sick and raise the dead and preach the gospel and feed the hungry, didn't he? Then this is the will of God for man. And when you talk about the will of God producing an accident, or the will of God causing this person's death, even if they're 190 years old, God has made no provision for death. God has no pleasure in your dying. Turn ye and live. Now, to witness the Master's revelation, and I walk up and down those holy lands with him year in and year out, year in and year out, and his whole presence is nothing but a benediction. And that, he says, is the will of God. That's what he came to do. Not my work, not my message. No. If I speak of myself, I bear witness to a lie. This ministry of mine is the ministry of God through me. And there was no death in it, and there was no disease in it, and no punishment in it. Do you see that? No. Sooner or later, the people of the world who are reading writings like mine, or who are watching what Bishop Pike is saying, or the Bishop of Woolwich, and all these people who are changing their idea of God, someday they're going to hit up against that literature that says Jesus Christ's ministry was the will of God on earth, and in it is no withholding, no lack of forgiveness, no excommunication. See that? Nothing like that. The sinner will be just as welcomed as the saint, because the sinner has come to be made a saint. This is the age when everyone is going to raise their concept of God until they have a God 100% love, in whom is no evil, no punishment, no withholding, no death, no disease, no accidents. A God revealed by the Master. I am come that ye might have life, and that ye might have it more abundantly. Was he speaking only to saints when he said that? No, he was speaking to anyone who would hear my voice. I knock at the door of your consciousness. Open it and let me in, and then I will show you the life abundant. I will not criticize you. I will not condemn you. I will not judge you. Who will make me a judge over you? I will merely extend to you God's grace, which will lift you up. And you will never feel from my mind or my lips any condemnation. And you know, the most miraculous things have happened. We have a student who for nearly all of his adult life was croupier in a gambling house. In Los Angeles, we had a woman telephone who was a prostitute and wanted help. We have so many people who have been alcoholics, who have been drunkards, who have been thieves. We've had so much work in prison. I was barred from prison work here by the Council of Churches because the warden reported that I was having so much success with the men there that he wondered if the church couldn't do something to have the same success. So they had a law passed that I can't go in because I don't represent an organized church. But the warden saw to it that we got in on a different basis. I wish you could only know the beautiful work, the things that take place. You know why? Once we have seen this God, we can never again judge, criticize, or condemn a man for anything he does. It's instinctive with us. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. If they only knew they could live by grace instead of by theft. But we'll teach it to them, that is, to those who are willing. Not every man in prison for 30, 40, and 50 at a time. You see? Now, the benefit of all of this is this. For a long time, I didn't know that why. Later I found out. When I'm on the platform, people feel uplifted. They feel light. They go out feeling freer. Well, I don't do anything consciously to bring that about. I mean, I'm there just to deliver a message. And then I saw they come into the atmosphere of my consciousness in which is no condemnation, no criticism, no judgment, no calling them sinners. Okay? And that it is that takes the burden of guilt off of them. I was invited to talk to the men in the Alcatraz of England by the Church of England chaplain there. He's a Brother Mason, and we had met in the lodge, and so he invited me down. And I had to sit there through his whole Sunday morning service, and then he turned it over to me. And I spoke to the boys. And if you could see the way those boys afterward went out, how they shook hands, how they were smiling. And the minister said, Joel, what makes such a change in them? Why can't I do that? And I said, you ask for truth, I'll give it to you. Do you know that I had to sit there and listen to you make these men sing 5 hymns, in every one of which they are mortal sinners that are going to fry? Why, you even had me feeling guilty. Now, what must these men feel when you get through with them? They come in knowing they're sinners. But that's not enough. The minister isn't going to have forgiveness for them or lightness. He's going to remind them that they're sinners. And do you see what I'm getting at? You can't succeed. He resigned his position right after that. He said, as long as I can't benefit them, I might as well get out. You can't benefit anyone when you're criticizing, judging, condemning, sitting in judgment, can you? And the Master didn't do that, did he? His whole ministry is one of love, forgiveness. And why? It wasn't that he was so loving. It was because he was performing the ministry of his Father. And that was the mission given him, not to sit in judgment, criticism, condemnation, but forgive. Not caring what you did tomorrow. If you want to go and sin tomorrow and get punished again, that's your business. But this day you have come to me and received your forgiveness, and that's my mission. You'd be surprised how a whole ministry changes the moment you begin to think about God from the standpoint of the soul of the universe, that which sent it all into expression, and that which does not withhold, not punish, and doesn't give just when you pray for it. And of course now, prayer becomes an attitude and an altitude, because having released God from any nonsensical belief that God gives or withholds, having released God from the need to exercise a miraculous power, since there is but the one power of God, our prayer now is the ability to commune within ourselves with this transcendental presence, which we know is the very soul of our being. And it is closer to us than breathing, and therefore we can commune with it in silence. And communion is a silence because it is not necessary for words to pass from us to God. God is already the all-knowing. And in our attitude of listening, we are receptive and responsive to the presence and to the power of God, to the will of God, to the way of God, to the thoughts of God. And sometimes the still small voice does speak. Sometimes it thunders. But always when it speaks, the earth melts. And for it to speak does not necessarily mean using a language, because God can speak to us also in just and in a warmth, a glow, a feeling of the presence, an awareness of something greater than human expression. And that, of course, is the divine communion. We commune with God without having to voice anything to God, without having to think any thoughts toward God, but our communion is more or less a listening attitude and then gradually a melting into each other.